Hello friends, I am Rishayan. I was asked to make a video on how did I learn Spanish. Well, it might have helped that I have Mexican in me that I didn't know until I was in my late teens, early 20s, but maybe that helped. But actually, the first time, as I'm trying to think, the first time I spoke Spanish, I didn't take Spanish when I was in high school. I took French because my maternal grandmother was from Quebec, Canada, and she spoke French. But had no idea that I'd be someday living in Mexico. I guess I think I started learning Spanish when I lived in Miami, Florida. And this was, let's see, must have been around 20 years old. And I worked in hotels, and I remember I was a switchboard operator in hotels. I had gotten jobs relatively easy because I had worked for Southwestern Bell prior to that for a couple years, and so I was, long story, but I ended up in Miami Beach, and easily I got jobs. And I remember one of the hotels, I think it was a Delito Hotel, I have no idea if that's still there, I think it was called Delito, that I had worked at as a switchboard operator. The manager handed me a book on learning Spanish. He said, you're going to need to learn Spanish because a lot of the guests are Hispanic or speak Spanish and don't speak English. At that time they received a lot of guests from Venezuela, but this was a different Venezuela. This was not the Venezuela of today. This was a prosperous Venezuela, the Venezuela of Betancourt. So I did. I studied the book, and I don't know, I picked up basic little Spanish just by the book on my own. And I remember communicating with the people in broken Spanish, and they liked it. You know, my people, Hispanic people, were cool people. You know, that's all I can say, and they were really cool about it. So that's probably the first time I spoke a little Spanish. Later on, when I realized my blood connections with Mexico, I was living in San Diego, and then later I started living in Tijuana, which is when my Spanish blossomed quite a bit. When I started living in Tijuana, I lived with the common people, and spent a lot of time in what they call the Zona Norte, which is the red light district of the city of Tijuana. I was still young, like in my early 20s, and I was having a good time. And but I learned street Spanish, the common Spanish, the Spanish that's spoken in the entire Mexican Republic, quite quick, which is full of very colorful language, quite frankly. But that's actually the best way to learn, because you understand what everybody says, because even the higher up people, they know that street Spanish too. They may not like it, but they know it and they understand it. So when you know the common Spanish, full of vulgarities, I think you say in the English, vulgarities, and very colorful language, you're able to speak to everybody, and you're able to understand everybody. And so that's how I basically, well, what happened, I don't remember what year, but I think it was in the mid-'80s. Yeah, the early to mid-'80s. I had been working for an air conditioning company in San Diego for a few years, and they went belly up. The manager, who was a very good person, the owners were friends of mine. I could call them friends. They were very, very good people to me. But they had visions of grandeur, I guess you could say, and he overextended himself in the business. They were quite successful in the beginning, but he just started buying trucks and equipment, and rented a new office, a new shop, and whatever. That then all of a sudden the bills started coming in, and he couldn't pay. So he went bankrupt, and so that was sort of the end of my career there. He had to lay off like everybody almost, and but it gave me the opportunity to live in Tijuana full-time, because I was getting unemployment. And so without unemployment at that time, whatever it was, I don't remember, but it was certainly enough to pay rent and to eat and to live good and to continue my red light district life in Tijuana for a few months. And during that few months, my Spanish went from mediocre to not quite fluent, but almost. I quickly learned Spanish. So how did I do that? I never had a teacher. I never paid anybody to teach me Spanish. I never had a Spanish teacher. Like I said, in school I did not take Spanish, I took French. So I never learned it in that form, other than that one time that they handed me that book, you know, Spanish Made Easy or something like that, when I was working in Miami Beach. But I learned it just like, I used I've done the same video in Spanish already. I think it's the first time I'm doing it in English. But as the example is that I'd be in a room, I was in a room with my friends, and that we had rented, and to save money, it was like 3 or 4 of us all in the same room. And I remember they would say, cierra la puerta, cabrón. You know, and they said it real fast like that, and I didn't, you know, I didn't really get it, but I did understand puerta, which is door, and they'd say, cierra la puerta, cabrón. You know, they'd become more excited because they were common people, right? And, you know, I said, man, puerta, door, but he said it so fast I just couldn't get it. So then he'd get up and he'd slam the door shut, and he said, cierra la puerta. And then, I mean, pow. That was it. They never had to say it again. I knew every time they said, cierra la puerta, it meant close the door, you know. And then he'd say, apaga la luz, you know. Luz, light. Well, but they were saying it too fast, you know. Apaga la luz, idiota, you know. And that's how they talked, really, you know. And it meant, you know, then he'd get up and he'd pull down the switch and apaga la luz, you know, turn off the light, you know. And that's really how I learned it. I learned it by actual experience with my friends. And like I said, it was a very, very common street Spanish. And I learned it real quick. And that's definitely the best way, you know, to learn any language, you know, any language. You have to mix with the people, you know, you have to get deep into the culture. I'll use a little story too that that happened to me because of the street Spanish that I learned. I had learned that the phrase for "there's no problem," of course they you know, they say "no problema," or I don't know how the English-speaking people say it, you know, incorrectly, but basically the term in Mexico, and it's a vulgar term, is "no hay pedo," "no hay pedo," you know. And I didn't know really what that meant. Actually, I knew what it meant, but I didn't know what it meant technically, you know, word by word. But I just knew that "no hay pedo" means no problem. You know, there's, you know, no problem. Go ahead and do that. No hay pedo, you know. And so a couple years later, I was living in Puerto Vallarta, Jalisco, which is a big tourist resort, Puerto Vallarta. And I had gotten a job in a restaurant, and well, one thing led to the other, but I very quickly went up because of being, at that time I was fairly, I'd say like 80% fluent in Spanish by that time, and also of course fluent in English. And so they had a lot of English guests that came there, and the manager liked me, and so I went from literally from cleaning toilets to assistant to the manager in just like 2 weeks. I mean, I'm not joking. But anyways, I had these radios, you know, because I was in charge of part of the operations. It was a big tourist restaurant, and I was in charge of part of the operations, and we had these radios. And I remember one of the supervisors had called me on the radio saying, you know, can I do this or this or this or this? And I said, sí, no hay pedo. Which to common people would be nothing. But I noticed that after I said that, from all corners of the restaurant, it was a large complex, I'd hear this laughing. You know. And then one of the other assistant managers came and said to me, you know, he said, look, he said, that's sort of vulgar what you said. I said, well, what did I say that's so vulgar? He said, you said no hay pedo. Do you know what no hay pedo means? I said, no. I mean, it means there's no problem, you know. He said, no. He says, it means there's no fart. Pelo is fart, F-A-R-T, fart, you know. And in Spanish, it sounds really vulgar. You know, their way of saying no hay problem in a vulgar way is there's no fart. You know, I know it makes no sense in English, but it makes a lot of sense in Spanish. And he said, you know, say no hay problema, you know, something like that. That's more correct. There's no problem, you know, but don't use the term no hay pelo because it sounds bad. I said, I never knew. I said, I never knew until that time. And I had been speaking Spanish now for like 5 years. And I didn't know. Nobody ever told me. And I always said, no hay pelo, you know. And that's how I learned, you know. Another thing, at that same restaurant, and there was another occasion, these are funny things that happen really when I think back on them, but the way you use words. In this case, I was not using a word incorrect. What I was saying was completely correct, but there's a way that things are understood differently. And one day I was, again, with the radio, somebody called down from the office, and they said, I guess I was close, or no, they didn't have a radio or something. Anyways, they called down from the office, and they said, will you call on the radio to the manager, you know, my boss, and tell him that he has a phone call from his mother, you know, to come up to the office and his mom's calling on the phone. I said, okay. So I called him on the radio, and he answers. I said, you know, you have a llamada telefónica en la oficina, you know, you have a telephone call up in the office. And he said, who is it? I said, tu madre. Which is correct. Technically correct. I said, your mother. Tu madre. But also the term tu madre is sort of a short form of chinga tu madre, which is F-U. I know if you don't know Spanish, if you know Spanish, you'll be laughing. But if you don't know Spanish, it doesn't make any sense, but it does. But it is. I mean, you know, it's just tu madre, when you say it sort of in a certain way, tu madre, it's sort of like F-U, you know, basically what it comes out to. And I had just got done saying that to my boss innocently, and he knew that it was innocent. I didn't get in trouble for it. Again, somebody came and explained it. Again, there was laughter like in the whole restaurant. The people, I'll tell you, the other employees, they had a lot of fun with me. You know, they laughed all the time. I mean, but that was explained to me. He said it would have been better to say tu mama, you know, your mama, which is, now that I think of it, that sounds bad in English, right? Your mama. Oh man, this is something this complex with these languages. But that sounds okay in Spanish. You can say tu mama is perfectly okay in Spanish. You know, I mean, technically it's okay to say tu madre, but it's best not to use it when you're in that type of situation. Anyways, so that's how I learned Spanish. And then, of course, I've lived there for like, wow, 40 years, going on 40 years. And in fact, I'll be back in my house here soon. And I love my country, Mexico. And, you know, I still don't consider a lot of people say, oh, you speak perfect Spanish and you're fluent and this and that. Well, I guess I could call myself fluent, but I still feel like I want to speak even better, you know. And I still learn new words. One of the things about learning Spanish from common people, for example, the area that I live in is an area where there's a very high level of illiteracy. And it's an indigenous area where the indigenous people do not speak perfect Spanish, because that's their second language. Their first language is their indigenous language. I remember another little story. I was with a friend of mine in the village that I live in one time, and had been talking in the street or something, and then I went to visit her, and she said, oh, was that you out there in the street? She said, I thought it was an Indian, because I heard the voice and the Spanish that I heard, that's the way the Indians speak Spanish. I said, well, thank you. You know, that was like a compliment that you confused me, my language, the way I speak Spanish, with the way the indigenous people speak Spanish. In other words, you know, it's not really broken Spanish, but just an accent. I guess the accent a little different. And but I took it as a compliment. That's cool, you know. But being with people, we have a very horrible educational system in the rural area that I live in. It's probably the worst on the planet Earth, to tell you the truth. So a lot of the local people, those that aren't illiterate, are almost illiterate. Even the young people, they do not speak, how can I say, the King's Spanish, you know. It's a rough Spanish. So they understand me, I understand them, and that's all that counts, you know. We both are not really speak perfect Spanish, you know. We speak a vulgar Spanish, which is very common. Hey, that's right down my alley. That's the way I learned Spanish. And so where I live now, it's perfectly fine. And they completely understand me, and I completely understand them. But the thing is, when I go to another part of Mexico, especially the city, where people are more refined, yes, of course I understand them, but I have to be careful the way I talk, because they're not used to that vulgarity, which is very common. From the oldest old people to the youngest little babies, they all speak that way, and it's just the way they speak, you know. So whatever. Anyways, I hope that explains how I, Rishayan, learned Spanish in Mexico. Thank you very much. Have a nice day.